Greetings everyone. In this video, my group is going to be discussing how different approaches to statutory interpretation together with internal and external aids help judges to resolve uncertainty in legislation. But before we get any further, let's dive deep into the basics of the topic. Now, what is statutory interpretation? It refers to the process by which courts examine and interpret the meaning and application of laws passed by legislators. It is crucial to interpret these laws, particularly when they contain ambiguities or ambiguous wording that fails to properly define legal rights and obligations. Now we're going to be looking into the relevance of statutory interpretation. The process of interpreting statutes is crucial in the legal reasoning process under common law jurisdictions. First, you get to understand the purpose of statute. This entails looking at the statute's language, the context in which it was enacted, and the legislative intent behind it. For example, the court must interpret a statute that is intended to protect the environment that advances that goal. Secondly, it is relevant in the role of precedent. The principle of stare decisis, or the essence of precedent, is also relevant to statutory interpretation. Stare decisis is the principle where judges are bound by previous judicial decision to make decision for similar cases. Hence, statutory interpretation helps to ensure consistency and predictability in the application of law. Third, statutory interpretation is also relevant in the use of legislative history. A statute's legislative history may occasionally have relevance to the interpretations of statute. Examining the arguments and conversations or debates that occurred throughout the legislative process is part of the process. This can provide insight into the intent behind the statute and the meaning of specific provisions. Lastly is the role of judiciary. The judiciary plays a part in interpreting the statutes and applying them in individual cases. Hence, this requires a careful analysis of the language, purpose, context of the statute, and the understanding of the relevant precedent and legislative history. Now, one example of case of the importance of statutory interpretation is evident in the case of R versus R. In this case, the House of Lords interpreted the meaning of rape under the Sexual Offences Act 1956. The court decided that the word should be given its ordinary meaning and that it's applied to all forms of non-consensual sexual intercourse. Now we're going to be looking into the four main rules of statutory interpretation, which is literal rule, golden rule, mischief rule, and persuasive approach. Next, we're going to be looking into the aids to interpretation. It contains of two different types of aids, like internal aids and external aids. Internal aids are preamble, long and short titles, headings, schedules, marginal notes, interpretation sections. External aids, on the other hand, contains of previous acts on the same topics, earlier case laws, historical setting, dictionaries of the time, Hansard, reports of law reform bodies, and international treaties.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shreya, and today I'll be explaining the literal rule of statutory interpretation, which is one of the core methods used by the courts when interpreting acts of parliament. To begin, the literal rule is an approach where judges interpret statutory words using their plain, ordinary, and natural meaning, exactly as they appear in the legislation. What makes this rule unique is that judges must apply the words literally, even if doing so leads to an outcome that seems harsh, unfair, or completely unintended. This strict approach comes from a famous statement by Lord Asher in R.V. Judge of the City London Court, where he said that if words of an act are clear, the court must follow them even though they lead to a manifest absurdity. So under the literal rule, the court's job is not to rescue the parliament from poor drafting or to guess what parliament might have meant. The court simply follows what parliament actually said. Now, the reason behind this strictness lies in the UK's constitutional principles. Parliament is a supreme law-making body and the judiciary must respect that. The court's role is to apply the law, not change it. This idea is supported by the Sussex Peerage case where Lord Tyndall explained that the Act of Parliament must be interpreted according to their natural and ordinary meaning. By following the literal meaning, judges promote certainty, predictability, and consistency. It ensures that similar cases are treated the same way and that judges don't add their personal opinions into the law. Professor Michael Zander supports this, saying that the literal rule encourages precise drafting and makes sure that the parliament makes the laws, not the courts. However, even though the literal rule protects the separation of powers, it also has its weaknesses. Because it focuses strictly on words used, it can sometimes produce outcomes that appear absurd or unjust. A famous example is Whitley v. Chappell. The defendant used the identity of a dead person to vote. The statute made it an offense to impersonate someone entitled to vote. Since a dead person is not literally entitled to vote, the court had no choice but to acquit him. The outcome clearly feels absurd, but the judges stuck to the literal meaning. Another example is Fisher v. Bell, involving a flint knife displayed in a shop window. The law made it an offense to offer for sale such knives, but under contract law, a display in a shop window is only an invitation to trade, not an offer. So again, the defendant could not be convicted. The wording simply did not match the situation. These cases highlight the main criticisms of the literal rule. It focuses on what the parliament actually wrote, not what the parliament intended. This can support legal certainty, but also sometimes it works against justice. Despite these criticisms, the literal rule remains an essential tool in statutory interpretation. It reinforces parliamentary sovereignty, protects judicial lawmaking, and keeps the courts within their constitutional boundaries. By requiring judges to interpret statutes exactly as written, the rule promotes fairness through consistency, even if it occasionally leads to rigid or unexpected outcomes. In conclusion, the literal rule plays a vital role in the UK legal system. It forms the foundation for statutory interpretation, reminding us the law must be applied as written, not as imagined. While it may sometimes produce odd results, it ultimately protects certainty, clarity, and the authority of the parliament. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Joey, and I'll be discussing the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule is viewed as a modification of the literal rule. In its general form, it is applied where the strict application of the literal rule will lead to a result that is obviously absurd or inconsistent with the purpose of the statute. The Golden Rule was first started by Lord Wensleydale in Gray and Parsons Act 1857, but it was later clarified by the Lord Blackburn and Riverware Commissioners and Adamson Act 1877. The court should interpret a statute as a whole and give words their ordinary meaning, unless doing so will result in an inconsistency or absurdity. Importantly, judges cannot use the Golden Rule simply because they dislike the statutory wording, and it is only invoked when a problem arises from applying the literal meaning. In applying this rule, judges often rely on what they believe Parliament intended, which raises questions about the scope of judicial discretions and the role of public policy in interpretations. The Golden Rule can be applied in two ways, which are the narrow and a wider approach. When under the narrow approach, the rule is used when a word or phrase in a statute has two possible meanings. The court chooses the interpretation that avoids an absurd or unreasonable outcome. This was illustrated in Adler and George, 1964. In Adler and George, the defendant was charged with obstructing a member of the armed forces in the vicinity of a prohibited place. He argued that the phrase did not apply to someone inside the prohibited place. The court rejected this argument and held that in the vicinity of included being inside the area as a literal interpretation would defeat the purpose of the act. Another key example is R. and Allen Act 1872, where the court interpreted the word marry to mean to go through a marriage ceremony. Under Section 57 of the Offences Against the Person Act 1861, bigamy is an offence. The word marry could literally mean to be legally married. But if that meaning were applied, no one could ever commit bigamy because a second marriage while the first is still valid would not be legally recognized. Therefore, it would be impossible to marry in a literal sense. So court applied the Golden Rule to avoid this absurdity. The wider approach applies when a statute wording has only one meaning, but applying it literally will lead to an unjust or absurd result. In Re Sigworth, 1935, a son murdered his mother, and the mother died intestate. Under the administration of Estate Act 1925, the next kin in this case, which is her son, would normally inherit her estate. The court interpreted the statute to mean that a murderer cannot inherit from his victim even though the word of the act did not explicitly say so. In this case, the literal rule would have allowed the son to benefit from his crime, which would be absurd and contrary to the public policy. Therefore, the golden rule was used to modify the literal meaning and prevent injustice. Similarly, in R.N. National Insurance Commissioner, a woman who killed her husband was denied a widow's pension on the same grounds. The statutes did not state whether a person who unlawfully killed their spouse could claim a widow's pension. The National Insurance Commissioner denied the claim on the basis that it would be unreasonable and contrary to the public policy to allow someone who caused the death to benefit from such a pension. In both approaches, the golden rule enables judges to modify literal meanings to prevent absurdity and injustice while still respecting the overall intention of Parliament. That's all from me. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sushmita and I'll be talking about the Mischief Rule. So the Mischief Rule is a doctrine of statutory interpretation that guides judges to look at the intent behind the law by considering the mischief or problem that the law was created to remedy. It helps judges ensure that the law is enforced in accordance with the intention of Parliament in order to avoid an absurd result with the literal interpretation of the law. It focuses on what the legislature meant to achieve rather than what it says by looking at the specific gap that the statute intended to fix. Hayden's case is one of the most significant in early English law decisions in statutory interpretation and the landmark case which laid down the elements of the Mischief Rule. The court laid down the four-part test that became known as the Mischief Rule. It was held that when interpreting any statute, judges must consider four key matters. The first being what was the common law before the act. Judges must first understand what the legal position was before the statute was passed. The second is what was the mischief or defect the common law did not provide. Identify the problem or gap that Parliament wanted to fix when creating the law. Third, what was the remedy that Parliament wanted to solve? Examine what the Act says and what Parliament intended to be the solution to that mischief. Lastly, what was the reason for that remedy? Judges were to determine the underlying reason of the law or why Parliament decided to change the law. Now, in the case of Smith and Hughes, prostitutes were charged under the Street Offences Act 1959 for soliciting in a street or public place, while, however, they were calling out to men from their balconies. So the issue to be decided by the court was whether or not their balconies were considered a street or public place. By applying the Mischief Rule, the court held that the purpose of the Street Offences Act 1959 was to clean up the streets and prevent people from being solicited in public. Therefore, the mischief identified here was soliciting in a street or public place, and they can be charged under the Street Offences Act 1959. The court had interpreted the statute broadly, even though it happened on private premises, focusing on the intent of Parliament behind it rather than its literal meaning. In the case of Royal College of Nursing and the Department of Health and Social Security 1981, the Abortion Act 1967 allowed abortions to be performed by a registered medical practitioner. Medical advances meant that nurses could also safely perform certain procedures. However, nurses were not considered a registered medical practitioner. The courts had to examine whether or not the Act allowed nurses to perform abortions. By applying the Mischief Rule, it was noted that the Act claimed to prevent unsafe abortions by ensuring abortions were carried out safely under medical supervision. Therefore, it allowed the involvement of nurses.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I will be talking about the purposive approach of statutory interpretation. So what is the purposive approach? The purposive approach goes further than the Mischief Rule, rather than only identifying the legal gap Parliament intended to fix. This method asks a more broader question: what was the Parliament trying to achieve through enacting this legislation? Judges using this approach interpret legislation in a way that fulfills Parliament's underlying objective. This means that they may depart from rigid or overly technical readings of statutory language, but such interpretations would frustrate the intentions of the lawmakers. And how and why did this approach develop? So, the purposive approach gained significant traction in the UK due to the influence of European Union law and the European Court of Justice. And before Brexit, UK courts were required to interpret domestic statutes consistently with the aims and objectives of the European Union directives. And interestingly, even after Brexit, the purposive approach has not disappeared. Instead, it remains embedded in the UK legislation because it reflects a more modern expectation of fairness and flexibility and practicality in law. And Lord Denning, he's one of the strongest advocates championing this purposive approach. And in the case of Mago St. Mellon's Newport Corporation, he famously quoted this: "We sit here to find out the intention of the Parliament and carry it out, and we do this better by filling in the gaps and making sense of the enactment than by opening it up to destructive analysis." And through his statement here, he emphasized that common sense, pragmatism, and social purpose should be incorporated when it comes to interpreting legislation. And his approach also reflects the belief that law is a living instrument and must be applied in a way that advances justice. And we're going to be looking at a couple of cases, and one of it is our Quantible Secretary State of Health 2003. So this case concerns the Human Fertilization and Embryology Act 1990, which defines an embryo as one created by fertilization of an egg by sperm. However, science later developed and scientists developed this cloning process called cell nuclear replacement (CNR). It's a process where it creates embryo without the need of fertilization. And under a literal reading, cloning embryos would fall outside the scope of this act, and this would create a dangerous loophole. And so it was held the House of Lords applied the purposive approach, and they ruled that the Parliament's intention behind this act was to regulate all embryos created outside the human body, regardless of any scientific method used. And this case demonstrates how the purposive approach keeps the law relevant and adaptable in relation to changing social needs and technological advancement. And another powerful case is our Registrar General, Experts mid-1990s. So this case concerns the Adoption Act 1976, which gave adopted individuals over 18 the right to obtain their original birth certificates. Smith met all the statutory conditions. However, he was a convicted murderer and also diagnosed with a severe mental disorder. And there were credible evidence suggested that he intends to harm his biological mother if he is able to discover her identity. And under a literal interpretation, this would force the Registrar General to release the birth certificate to Smith regardless of its consequences. And it was held the court refused his request and applied the purposive approach and ruled that the Parliament's intention behind this act was to support adopted individuals' mental well-being. And this case also highlights how the purposive approach acts as a safeguard against injustice. It also demonstrates how strict literalism can produce dangerous and absurd results that Parliament never intended.
Good morning, my name is Yinting, and today I'll be discussing aids to interpretation, which are tools that help judges understand the true meaning and intention behind laws passed by Parliament. Before I dive into what internal and external aids are, I'd like to discuss a little bit about the 4 verbal maxims of statutory interpretation. These are Latin principles judges often use to make sense of the words in law. First, we have nociter a socis, which is a word is known by the company it keeps, which essentially means that the meaning of a word can depend on the words around it. Second, expressio unius est exclusio alterius, which means the express mention of one thing excludes others. If a law mentions certain things specifically, anything not mentioned is usually left out. Third, in pari materia, on the same subject matter. When 2 laws deal with the same topic, they should be read together to make sense of them. Fourth, ad justem generis, of the same kind or class. If a list of specific words is followed by a general word, that general word is then interpreted in the same category as the specific ones mentioned. Here I have a case example, Powell against Kempton Park Racecourse 1899. This case is a classic example of the adjustum generis rule. In this case, the Betting Act 1853 made it illegal to keep a house, office, room, or other place for betting. The question here was whether an open-air betting area called a Tattersall ring was included. The courts then ruled no. They looked at the words house, office, room, which are all enclosed places, and decided that other place should also mean an indoor area. Hence, only indoor betting areas were prohibited. This case perfectly shows how judges use both verbal maxims and internal aids to figure out what Parliament meant at that time. Now, let me get into what internal aids are. They are tools inside the law itself that help judges understand the meaning of words and sections. Some examples here are preamble. Preamble introduces the law and explains why it was made. Second, long and short titles, where the long title explains the law's purpose in detail and the short title is just a quick and easy name, which makes it easy for judges to just reference. Headings shows what each section is about. Next, interpretation sections, which define important words so everyone knows exactly what they mean. Next, schedules, which contains extra details or tables that are added at the end of the law. And finally, marginal notes, which are short notes on the side that summarize or explain each section. Here I have a case law to showcase what internal aids are. In the case of R against Schildkamp 1971, the courts had to interpret the phrase in the course of the winding up of a company under the Companies Act 1948. The issue in this case was whether certain offences committed by a company officers during the winding up process fell within that phrase and were therefore punishable under the Act. The wording was unclear, so the judges examined the long title, headings, and overall structure of the Act to understand what Parliament intended in that moment. The conclusion was that the phrase should be interpreted in the context of the statute as a whole, not just by looking at the words in isolation. This ruling clarified that only offences closely connected to the actual winding up process were covered. This case perfectly illustrates how internal aids like titles, headings, and the structure of a statute can heavily influence and guide judges when the language is ambiguous. Next, external aids, which are tools outside the law. Judges use them when the law itself isn't clear enough. Examples include previous laws on the topic, earlier cases, historical context, dictionaries at the time, and Hansard law, as well as reform reports and even international treaties. A case example here is Pepper against Hart 1993. In this case, school teachers got discounts on their children's school fees. The question here was whether these discounts should be taxed as income. The law was unclear on this subject. Hence, the House of Lords allowed judges to look at the Hansard, which are official record of parliamentary debates, which entails the exact documentation of the conversation and debates that went on during the drafting of this act. Hence, they found that the finance minister had said such benefits weren't meant to be taxed. In this case, it shows that in certain situations, judges can use debates to understand what Parliament intended. To end off my explanation, I have an academic view from Francis Bunyan. In Statutory Interpretation and Legislative Intention 1990 of the Statute Law Review, it says that aids to interpretation assist judges to ascertain the intention of the legislature by reference to the fullest material available. This shows that both internal and external aids are important. They help judges apply laws correctly, avoid unfair results, and make sure the law works the way Parliament intended to.
In conclusion, statutory interpretation principles are crucial in English courts. In addition to helping judges and other members of English courts interpret the acts of Parliament, the rules also provide appropriate instruments for comprehending legislative intents that may cause misunderstandings. In addition to distributing powers equally between Parliament and the courts, this regulation aims to reduce the number of poor rulings that result from judges' personal moods, thoughts, or errors. Now, this marks to the end of our video, and thank you for watching.